Martin Amis is here. By reputation, he is the bad boy rock star of British fiction, even though he is a grandfather now and lives in Brooklyn. His latest novel is The Zone of Interest. It is a dark satire set in a fictional branch of Auschwitz. As the Nazi war effort unravels, the murderous activity at the camp accelerates. Against that backdrop, an unlikely love story unfolds. The Zone of Interest is a controversial novel. Amis's French and German publishers rejected it. The French may have changed now. In his native Britain, reviewers are calling it his best work for 25 years. I am pleased to have Martin Amis back at this table. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Would you disagree with any part of that introduction?
No, I don't think so.
But you think this is the best work in 25 years?
I think it's got a chance of being my best novel.
Period.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. I'm very. When I pick it up, I'm very agreeably surprised and impressed by how it sort of hangs together. I thought it was going to ask a lot of the reader, but in fact, it seems to be. It moves along, and
But tell me what it was that drove you to want to do this, because you've touched on this elsewhere.
Yeah, I wrote a novel about it in 25 years ago, nearly. Well, novels come from your unconscious, and I once defined it as novels come from silent anxiety. It comes from what you don't know you're worrying about, but something's eating you, but it's subliminal. And you get a glimpse of this subliminal world, which is also your dream world as well. Sometimes you just get a shiver and a throb, and you think, now I can write fiction about this. And that's what makes you go forward. It's not any determination to investigate a historical event. It's just this donné, this gift from your subconscious. And all I had was, and it's expended on the very first page of the novel, is a sort of love at first sight moment against a violently implausible background or anomalous background. And I wrote the page, and as sometimes happens when all is going well, the rest of the novel just sort of appears to be there, and it's a great question of sort of burrowing, sculpting away at it and getting it into shape.
You said you were liberated when you read what Primo Levi had said. It is a sacred duty not to understand the Holocaust.
Yes, it was a real eureka moment for me, because I've been reading about this for a quarter of a century, and I was becoming frustratedly aware that while I knew much more than I used to, I hadn't penetrated it, not an inch. It seemed to me just as incomprehensible, as unbelievable as it had when I started seriously looking into it. In fact, I reread Martin Gilbert's The Holocaust, and I compared the two editions that I read them in, and the same exclamation marks in the margin, the same undiminished incredulity. And I thought, I cannot penetrate it. Then I read Primo Levi, who said, one must not understand it, because to understand is to include it within yourself, to absorb it, and we can't do that because
it is so horrific.
Well, he said because it's anti-human, really counter-human. The Nazi hatred is a hatred that is not in us; it is outside man. And for me, I've been trying to understand why they did it, and he takes the pressure off the why, and suddenly I could proceed.
And there is this wonderful dialogue in which I think one says, why, to a guard? And he says, you will not find why here.
Here there is no why.
Here there is no why.
Which is, he means there's absolutely no sort of rhyme or reason to it. But that was true of the whole policy. It's a remarkable fact that no historian claims to understand Hitler, and many of them make a point of saying that they don't. And some, like Alan Bullock, his first British biographer, said the more I learn about Hitler, the harder I find it to understand. And
you say that you constantly even find yourself intrigued by him, by that question.
Well, I do, because no one says it of anyone else. There are no historical figures who cause such universal consternation. No one would say that of Stalin. He is a kind of singularity, Hitler. And a couple of brilliant diarists, contemporary diarists, German diarists, said that this is all beyond history. It's all outside history, as if there's sort of a tear in the universe and this happened to take place.
There was this awful aberration.
Yes, and
more than that.
But something that felt supernatural. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't believe in the supernatural, but this certainly looks and feels supernatural. And, you know, whereas Stalin, who was a much more remarkable man than Trotsky ever gave him credit for. He said he was a grey blur, you know, mediocrity. Stalin was never that. But what he was a Marxist, so he tried the socialist experiment along rigid Marxist lines. And with the results that you see, trying to batter reality into this utopia, and reality resisting all the time, of course. But with Hitler, there's no real ideology. A couple of cheap and vulgar notions about race. The Jewish world conspiracy, which is the schizophrenic's first and most miserable cliche, and Lebensraum, you know, land empire, and that's it. And one German historian said that it was never an ideology. It was just a rallying cry for sadists, saying if you're prepared to kill and beat and rob for no provocation, then come to my flag and we'll march together.
Where does Hannah Arendt's banality of evil fit in here?
Well, was a very clever indeed, but they called that book on Eichmann in Jerusalem. She's proved herself to be the worst court reporter of all time, because she absolutely seemed to fall for Eichmann's self-exoneration when he said that I'm just a grey bureaucrat following orders. I don't have the imagination to do anything other. But Eichmann has been recently shown...
There's a new book on him.
Yeah.
Right.
Not at all banal. He said, I will leap laughing into my grave knowing that I have a million Jews, the death of a million Jews on my conscience. In fact, that was his great source of strength. I think the best thing that's...
Did you say that near the end?
Near-ish the end. I think the best remark about the banality of evil is Robert J. Lifton, the author of The Nazi Doctors, who said, they may have been banal when they started, and I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that, but once they started killing and producing in an atrocity-producing situation, they weren't banal anymore, and then they became...
They were what?
Monstrous. But it is perhaps the greater mystery. Hitler is a mystery, the German people, another mystery. And it's a slander of the Jews but it's not a slander of a huge fraction of the Germans, that they went like sheep to the slaughterhouse and donned the rubber aprons and got to work. The most highly educated society that ever been on earth was capable of that.
That's incomprehensible, too.
Yeah.
You quote from Macbeth, I am in blood, stepped so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as to gore.
It's a mystery to sane people why the war was lost very early on. It was lost in December 41 when the Blitzkrieg against Russia collapsed. Right. And Hitler acknowledges this in the war diary of the Wehrmacht. No victory can be won. 4 days later came Pearl Harbor, and he declares war on America. So he's got the USSR on one flank and the USA on the other, as well as the British Empire ranged against him. And then he's obviously thinking that the war aim of dominating Europe is over. But the war aim of killing the Jews is still achievable. And he sort of thought that was worth doing. And in his last will and testament, just a few days before his suicide, he said that I will be thanked by future generations for purging Europe of its Jews, that cancer of mankind. And he honestly thought that he'd done humanity a service. Now, I don't understand that.
Have you read anything that argues that if, in fact, he had not gone to Russia, if he had not learned the lessons of Napoleon,
well, the
war would have been different?
The first law of warfare is never invade Russia.
I know.
The same historian I mentioned, Sebastian Haffner, said that actually if we search for coherence in Hitler's psychology and actions, the only one that makes any sense is self-destruction. And once...
the only coherent idea is self-destruction.
Self-destruction. His ideas were inoperable. Land empire was a sort of pre-industrial notion that you could just swallow up these huge vistas. And once the war had failed, he homed in on a new enemy, Germans. And his conduct of the war, especially in the last year and a half, was designed to let the Russians in and not the Allies to the west, and to make it as rough as possible, make the defeat as thorough and disastrous as possible. National death was what he had in mind for Germany.
Talk about creating the characters. So tell me who Thompson is.
Thompson is he's a young SS officer. He's the nephew of Martin Bormann, and he's independently rich, and this gives him a sort of Selig aspect in that he pops up in various places in the Reich, and he does odd jobs for his uncle. In this case,
and with some protection from his uncle.
Yes, very much so. In this case, and the extent of this surprised me very much when I looked closely into it. Auschwitz consisted of 3 camps: Auschwitz I, Birkenau, where the killing took place, and Monowitz, which was sort of 5 kilometers away. And there they were building the biggest and most advanced plant in Europe. IG Farben was funding it, and the idea was to make Germany self-sufficient in rubber and in synthetic fuel.
Which could have been a factor in the war.
It could certainly have prolonged the war. When this factory was supposed to come online, it would have consumed more electricity than Berlin. And 30,000 Jewish slaves died trying to produce synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. Now, Golo Thompson, who's really the hero of the book...
Angelus Gola Thompson.
Yes, Angelus. He is one of millions of Germans. They sometimes say that about 40% of Germans hated the regime and obstructed it in as best they could, without putting their lives on the line all the way. Only a few people did that. So at first he's just an obstructor, gives bad advice, ideologically sound but ruinous advice. But then when the relationship with the commandant's wife blossoms into real feeling, then he starts to be an active saboteur. And he is discovered and arrested in the very last pages of the straight narrative of the book.
But protected to some...
Yeah, I mean, nothing... He does a few years in prison.
Now, why the affair? What's the purpose of having him have an affair with a commandant's wife?
It's not an affair. He doesn't even kiss her on the lips. It's just one kiss and a hug.
But it's an obsession? Is it what?
Well,
attraction?
What happened to Germans?
He falls in love?
Yes, he falls in love.
Right.
And that's what empowers him to become a real resistant and not just a foot dragger. What happened to ordinary, sane Germans was that they, after 1933, it wasn't horror that they regarded Hitler's promotion to the chancellery. It was a sort of complete sense of unreality, as if you were in a synthetic world. And then as the private space was crushed into almost nothing, you would think all your finer feelings would leave you, and you would think you'd be quite glad to see them go. You'd say, "Oh, let it go. I can't be thinking about poetry, about love," and you divest yourself of sensibility. And what happens to him in Auschwitz is that he feels that feeling coming back when he sees her.
So he gains a sense of what it means to be human.
Yes.
Yeah. And then there is, I don't know how to pronounce this.
Shmuel.
Shmuel.
He's a Polish Jew who's the most degraded of everyone in the whole story of the Holocaust. He is part of the special detail that deals not only with the corpses and processes them and shaves the head and gets out the fillings and grinds the bones and all that, but they also have to mingle with the evacuees when they arrive on the ramp and say, "Welcome, I hope you're not too tired after your voyage. You'll soon feel better when you have your meal at the guest house." Whereas in fact they were all going to be dead in an hour. Yeah. And so the most ambiguous, the most morally questionable of all the actors and they would be killed themselves. You only delayed your death by a few weeks, and in fact your first.
So he would be dead, and
yeah, but he prolongs it by making himself indispensable, which is agony because he's helping the German war effort in the war against the Jews. But the Sonders did occasionally save a life. They'd mingle with they'd go up to a young man and say, "You are 18 years old and you have a trade." This is as they're approaching the selection. And the Nazi doctor would look you over and say, "How old are you?" And you'd say 18. If you were any younger, you'd go straight to the gas. And you'd say, "I'm an electrician. I'm a carpenter." You would prove your worth that way. Imagine a job, Sonder Commander, where your first duty is to cremate your predecessors. And that's how they inducted them into the squad. And many Jews refused to do it outright and were killed at once.
Right away.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the magic mirror?
This is a story that, it's an old story, and I got it from a marvelous book called Journey Back from Hell, where I elaborate it a bit in the novel. But a king asks his wizard to make a magic mirror, a mirror that will not show you your reflection, but show you who you are, your soul. And he builds the mirror, he makes the mirror, creates the mirror. And the king can't look at it without turning away, and nor can the wizard. And in this peaceful land, the king offers any of his subjects a chest full of treasure if they can look at the mirror for a minute without turning away, and no one can. Now, because
of disgust with your soul?
Well, because you don't normally see more than about 5% of anyone, yourself included, and quite right that you shouldn't. That this terrible, just the tip of the iceberg, not the mass of the iceberg. But in a atrocity-producing situation like Auschwitz, you see the rest of the 95%, and everyone describes the experience as being one of a staggering surprise. As a perpetrator, you find that you can do it, or you like it. As a victim, you find enormous strength in yourself, and the voices of the survivors are of such a high level of perception and wisdom and aphorism that convinces you that what helped you survive was force of life. You had to have other things, immunity to despair, constantly cherishing your sense of innocence was Solzhenitsyn talks about that. And of course,
cherishing your sense of innocence.
Innocence, yeah. And Shmuel, of course, can't even do that because he doesn't feel innocent.
Yeah. Did he said, "I am choking, I am drowning"?
Yes, and that I need something more than words. He also saw his sons being killed in Chelmno, so it's as bad as it could be for Schmoll.
And then at the end of the war, Hannah, who was the wife of the commandant, who was the girl was in love with, he goes to see her.
He tracks her down. I got this insight from a married couple who were at Auschwitz together, a doctor and his wife. And they found themselves drifting apart after the liberation. And he said that he's a psychologist too, and he said what seems to have gone wrong is that when we were in this hellhole together, we looked to each other to represent civilization and normality. But now, after it's all over, they look at each other and they see the camp.
Yeah. And she says, I cannot be part of anything that suggests good could come out of the camp.
Yeah. And I was going to have her say, we're not French. But I thought that's too sweeping at that stage of the book. But
so, I mean, about writing about the Holocaust, I mean, just the whole idea of what Primo Levi said and others, Adorno basically said, the unimaginable, if you write about it, the unimaginable is stripped of some of its horror.
So you shouldn't write about it, is that what you said?
Absolutely.
Well, he also said no poetry.
That's the point, right?
No poetry after Auschwitz.
No poetry.
Yeah. But there was poetry during Auschwitz. Primo Levi, his fiction and his poems, and Paul Celan, who was in a Romanian work camp. And just to elaborate on why I think novelists and poets should be welcome, and
after the Holocaust,
when it says Arbeit macht frei, it shouldn't say poets and novelists not welcome. Where poets, novelists, historians, and philosophers are like the team that goes to investigate a crashed airplane. And that team cannot say when their work is done that there will be no more airplane crashes, but they can say there will be no more crashes for this reason. Planes won't crash because this happened again. And I think that in itself is enough to justify any thoughtful person from visiting this subject and reinforcing that investigation.
At the end of the day, what do you hope your writings accomplish?
Well, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd say I'm in the education business and I want to enrich my readers' lives. But I've since promoted myself in the scheme of things, having read Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is subtitled Why Violence Has Declined. Mm-hmm. And it's very counterintuitive because we think it's increased because there's so much more about it. But in fact, he proves that right across the board, violence has plummeted. And he gives the reasons: the emergence of the state, Leviathan taking the monopoly of violence, something that America neglected to do in the early 19th century when everyone else was doing that. Right. Invention of printing, the rise of women, very important. But one thing that he stresses, he says the novel helped make people less violent, because suddenly you're reading a novel and you're Clarissa Harlow, or you're, Tom Jones or Sophie Weston, that you're in another person's soul. He doesn't like the word empathy, but that imaginative sympathy is what the novel imbued in us. And if I can contribute a single molecule of this ameliorative presence in the novel, making the human race less violent, that's the effort you're involved in.
Thank you for coming.
Pleasure.
Martin Amis, the book is called The Zone of Interest. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.